Welcome back, Inebri-arts. This is Andy, the Inebri-art podcast, and I am once again recording from my COVID-19 bunker, buried deep below the earth. And I am joined today with someone I stumbled across on Twitter. I think that was how we got connected. John Woolf, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you.
John wrote a book, and I think that was the Twitter page for the book, I think is what caught my interest. Because I do like the macabre, the strange, the weird. I grew up with Unsolved Mysteries and Ripley's Believe It or Not TV shows and all that stuff.
Yeah.
And you wrote a book on basically sideshow freaks. Is that a correct term?
Yeah, the freak show.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us about let's just dive right into that book. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, so the book's called The Wonders, the Extraordinary Performers Who Transformed the Victorian Age. And what I do in the book is I take a series of different performers, predominantly from the 19th century, and I explore their lives. Some led, triumphant, some led tragic lives. And by kind of going into their human stories, I try and tell a broader history about the rise of the freak show. Which was, kind of rooted in the travelling fairs of Europe and Britain, and became this massive international phenomenon with the help of the American P.T. Barnum, obviously well known. So I kind of look at the broad history of the freak show by focusing on the lives of some of the performers who graced the boards of that popular form of entertainment.
So, just in case some people don't understand really what the freak show is, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, basically people who were born with deformities would partner with a circus or a traveling fair of some kind and basically put themselves on display for the public to look at for a fee. Is that roughly accurate? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there were different types of freak performers. So you had, to use freak show terminology, the born freak, so those who were born with physical abnormalities. But you also had what was known as the exotic freaks. So those would be like your blockheads and your geeks and...
Yeah, exactly. The so-called cannibals and savages from, distant lands. And they were kind of put on display because of their... cultural and racial and ethnic otherness.
Yeah.
And then you had the self-made freaks, so the tattooed men and women and sword swallowers. So there's kind of there's a plethora of different people described as kind of freakish. And exactly as you say, they'd go on display for the purposes of amusement. They'd amuse the people who were paying to see, but also profit. They'd make money. And it became this huge form of entertainment in the 19th century.
So I think if you tried to start a born freak type show, I know there's a few that, like Jim Rose has his traveling sideshow now. But if you try to start a born freak show, there would be huge uproar.
Yeah.
Why was the public okay with it at that time?
Yeah, it's a great question. It was a completely different world at the time. I mean, the term freak now has that kind of, we sort of almost recoil at it. It's got that negative connotation. And it's why I always use the term freak performer. There's kind of a difference between the freak as an act, as a piece of art, if you like, as a public persona, which is different to the freak performer, private individual who had a life on stage. But in the 19th century, sensibilities were very different. And so lots of freaks of nature, as they were known, from the 1840s, it was not seen as a sort of grotesque, weird, cruel, exploitative thing. The freak show was seen as a respectable form of theatre, and these were essentially actors or performers who were making a living from their extraordinary bodies. So the sensibilities were very different, and this was long before the rise of the disability rights movement in the 1960s, long before kind of a greater PC culture took over. And in the 19th century, it was going to the freak show was a really normal thing to do. Everyone from Abraham Lincoln to Queen Victoria were big fans of the freak show.
And how were the performers treated? I mean, were they treated more as celebrities or more as outcasts?
It really depends, and that's one of the things that's so interesting about the freak show. There were some performers, a guy named Charles Stratton, aka General Tom Thumb, who was like the first international celebrity in the world, and he made a lot of money. He was well known by European kings, queens, princes, American presidents, and he was on the whole well treated. Although, and there's always a flip side in this, he was also thrust on stage when he was 4 years old. So charges of exploitation are very much apt for the Victorian freak show. And you had other performers who were terribly exploited. So it's kind of hard to sort of cast a generalization over the whole phenomenon. Sometimes there was exploitation, sometimes there was empowerment, sometimes it was choice, sometimes coercion. It really depended.
And it's weird, like how many, when you really kind of stop and think about it, how many terms we use just kind of off the cuff without realizing their origin. I mean, I use the term geek as a descriptive of someone who eats things, but people use it all the time. How like Best Buy uses it to describe their computer team, the Geek Squad.
Wait, you use it? So I've never heard that, geek, for someone who eat. What was that? How
isn't
do you use it?
Geek? Isn't that the circus term for someone who like will eat, the heads off a chicken?
Eat the heads off. Yeah. I mean, you still use that term for that kind of like nasty eater.
Do we still do?
I think I misheard you. I thought you said you still use the term.
Oh, no. I mean, we still use the term, but we don't use it in the,
for
we
nerds.
don't realize where it came from. Is what I'm saying.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Siamese twin is a freak show term, Chang and Ang, and, that sort of thing. So we kind of use those terms. Like, I don't think people realize how huge these things were, the Circus Side show or the Geek show, or the Freak show rather. So who were some of who was the Brad Pitt of the Freak show?
Well,
or David Beckham. I'm sorry, I don't know.
David Beckham. He's not so big anymore.
All right.
All due respect to David Beckham. I mentioned him before, but Charles Stratton, General Tom Thumb. I mean, this was a guy who really kind of transformed the standing of the freak show as well, particularly in Britain and also in America, because before the 1840s, when he was first displayed.
And he was a small person, right?
Yeah. He was about 23 inches tall, a small person of short stature. And before he was put on display, kind of discovered in quotation marks by P.T. Barnum, the freak show was really this sort of like marginalized. It wasn't very respectable. It certainly wasn't very theatrical form of entertainment. And it was quite itinerant. It traveled around America and Europe, but it was kind of looked down upon. But when Tom Thumb, Charles Stratton, hit the stage, he really almost overnight changed the fortunes of the freak show because he was a great performer. He actually had a full performance routine in mimics and acting and singing. He had a great voice. And he's, with the help of P.T. Barnum, who displayed him at the American Museum in the 1840s, he kind of helped make freakery respectable. And when he came over to Europe in 1846, he managed to get a meeting with Queen Victoria. And she was so enamored and wowed with him that P.T. Barnum, who was with Tom Thumb at the time of the tour, made a big deal out of this. Charles Stratton, the pet of the palace, the Queen's dwarf. And suddenly in Britain, there was what the press referred to as a deformitomania, an obsession with deformity. And you had loads of different people of short stature and other freak performers who came to London to ride the wave of Tom Thumb's success. And so you had, from the 1840s, in due largely to Tom Thumb, but also P.T. Barnum, also Queen Victoria's endorsement, the freak show kind of rocketed into popular consciousness and became the form of popular entertainment from the mid to late 19th century.
So where did your fascination develop? Because it's kind of a weird thing. Because I know I enjoy it very much, but I know I'm weird. So, like, how did you come about getting into it?
I blame my parents, man. Like, it's their fault. When I was like, as most things.
Yeah.
When I was like 9 years old, my mum made me watch David Lynch's film, The Elephant Man.
Oh yeah.
Great film.
Yeah.
Lots of it is historically bollocks, but that's neither by nor by. And when I was 9, I remember like I was really scared because it was scary seeing this sort of deformed creature, Joseph Merrick.
Mm-hmm.
But I also felt like this real compassion for him as a human being, as Joseph Merrick. And that, I'm sure, planted a seed, because then throughout my teens, I was kind of always interested in the freakishness. I was really into wrestling, and I loved the masks of the wrestlers and that kind of like performative element.
Yeah.
And then as an undergrad, I studied a bit of history of psychiatry. And I then decided, having looked at sort of people deemed different because of their mental states, I thought I'd look at people deemed different because of their bodies. And that led me on to my PhD and looking at this. So short answer to your question is my mum's fault.
So is your PhD in freak shows?
Yeah, weird, right? I mean, literally, I've had a freakish obsession with this stuff for like 20 years.
Yeah.
And my PhD was in the history of the freak show.
That's
in
funny.
the 19th century. So the book was the book is much more like accessible than a PhD, and it's not sort of bogged down in all the theory. And it's kind of driven by narrative and stories. But it emerged from the PhD, which was, 3 glorious years of being in archives across America and across Europe.
So I got to ask, have you ever been to Middleborough, Massachusetts?
You know what? I haven't. I know, and it's terrible.
You know why I'm asking?
Yeah.
I asked because we were talking earlier. I'm in Plymouth, and before I moved to Plymouth, I lived in Middleborough. And oh my god, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. Now I can only think of Tom Thumb.
Lavinia Warren.
Yeah. His stage name was. Oh my god, why can't I think of his name now? I'm totally blanking. This is completely unprofessional. It's not Tom Thumb. Who's the other short stature famous?
Oh shit, I've got a blank now. What's he called?
Contagious.
Let me check the book. Wait, what's he called? No, I must.
Now I gotta Google it. I can't believe I'm forgetting this. Like, I lived around the corner from his house, and oh man,
what's he called? This is Joe. You don't mean Lavinia Warren? You're not thinking of his wife?
I don't think so.
I know who else I'm not sure if he's. Tom Thumb. Oh, what's he called?
Or am I confusing people? That's entirely possible.
Middleborough, Massachusetts is definitely Lavinia Warren, who Tom Thumb married.
Oh, okay. Why did I think he was from there?
No, Tom Thumb's from Bridgeport, Connecticut.
Okay.
Lavinia Warren's Middleborough, Massachusetts.
Oh, okay.
I know who else are you referring to? Because I can't believe I've forgotten his name. That's outrageous. $30,000 nut. What was he called? Commodore Nut. Is that who you were thinking of?
Maybe. I've been in quarantine too long. My brain has stopped working.
I know, it's terrible, isn't it?
But
were you thinking of George Washington Morrison Nut, Commodore Nut? That's who I was thinking of.
Yeah, I might have just gotten them confused. No, because so in Middleborough they actually have Tom Thumb's house, and I live like right around the corner from there.
That's so cool.
I just assumed that he he was from Connecticut and his wife was from Middleborough.
Yeah, so Lavinia Warren, who he married in 1861, was from Middleborough, and she kind of hit the freak show stage as well, and then met Tom Thumb, kind of thanks to P.T. Barnum. And they fell in love and got married at this massive ceremony in Grace Church, New York, in 1861, and shortly afterwards met Abraham Lincoln, and then went on a tour around Europe where they met Queen Victoria again, and then they had a tour around the world. And funnily enough, I was researcher for a documentary on General Tom Thumb, and the producers did go to Middleborough, Massachusetts, and Tom Thumb's house.
Yeah,
but alas, I wasn't there.
Maybe it's the general thing that's confusing me, because I think over here we'd just call him Tom Thumb. I don't think we. So
At the General.
Why did he add the General? Was it just like a part of his stage name? He wasn't enlisted.
Yeah. No, it was part of the stage name. So it was funny because when P.T. Barnum first met Charles Stratton, like I said, he was only 4 years old, 23 inches tall, from Bridgeport, Connecticut. And Barnum decided, in his autobiography, he talks about like embarking on an experiment. He's going to see if he could make Charles Stratton if he could make any money off him, essentially, as a freak show performer. So he inflated his age from 4 to 11 years old just to kind of deal with that issue. He changed his nationality from American to English because he thought English was a bit more exotic. And he gave him the name General Tom Thumb. Now, Tom Thumb was from an old fairy tale circulating since the 17th century. And the General that often happened in the freak show. They give a sort of military name to kind of aggrandize freak performers. And so he whacked on General at the end just to make Tom Thumb seem more kind of a higher status than he actually was. Thus was born General Tom Thumb.
So P.T. Barnum, I think pretty much everyone has heard of at least. Were there other, I know there were other traveling stations, but were there any famous ones? Yeah,
so in Britain, we've got the sort of, I refer to him as like Britain's Barnum equivalent, a guy called George Sanger. And again, he's a chapter in my book where I kind of follow his early years. He grew up in the English traveling fairs in the early 19th century, when at the time, it was incredibly dangerous terrain. His dad ran a peep show, and they'd set up their peep show in different fairs throughout Britain. The police were always out to get them. It was dangerous on the roads. They were kind of seen as social pariahs. The locals didn't like them. But George Sanger sort of emerged from these rowdy traveling fairs to set up his own circus in the 1850s. And that kind of went from strength to strength until the 1860s. He had about 7 circuses that were traveling around Britain. And he went on to meet Queen Victoria, and he changed his name to Lord Sanger to give himself a bit like General Tom Thumb, that added air. So he was kind of the sort of British equivalent. But, Barnum's interesting because I think a lot of what we understand about Barnum has slightly been tainted. And have you seen the show, The Greatest Showman?
No, not really my thing.
Not your cup of tea. Fair enough. It's great music, rubbish history. And it kind of like whitewashes P.T. Barnum. And actually, he was a complex man of his time who first found freak show fame off the back of a senile, paralyzed, elderly slave woman named Joyce Heth, who he lugged across the northeast of America, displayed as the 161-year-old nurse of George Washington.
Really? I've never heard of that.
Yes, yeah. Again, she's a fascinating character. Not much is known about her because of her slave background.
Yeah,
most of the records on slaves were destroyed. But when she died in 1836, under Barnum's watch, he decided to have a public autopsy to decipher if she really was 161 years old. And he made about $1,500, quite a lot at the time. Yeah. And she was publicly dissected to 15,000 spectators. And Barnum kind of first found his fame off the back of that, which kind of is a moral blotch on his record, and it's totally not included in The Greatest Showman, where he's presented as somewhat of a savior.
But he was always kind of a shyster, but he was so good at marketing, where he's like, I have an authentic mermaid, and then when they're like, that's the Fiji mermaid is a fake, he's like, come see the authentic fake mermaid, and made even more money,
Exactly.
He's just one of those guys that just always seemed to know how to spin it in his favor.
Yeah. Kind of like the father of fake news, if you like.
Yeah, kind of. So were you always wanting to write a book about this, or because you said you worked on documentaries too as well? So I mean, is it just this topic, or do you kind of expand out to other things?
No, so I do other things. I mean, my passion has kind of always been history, but I'm interested in different ways of disseminating, cool history, and I love history that's kind of rooted in human stories. So I've done quite a lot of TV work on this subject, but also on the Victorians more generally. Mm-hmm. And I co-wrote Stephen Fry's Victorian Secret, which was an Audible podcast, 12 chapters, narrated by Stephen Fry, written by myself and another co-writer, which was looking at all the sort of salacious, dark aspects of the 19th century. So that was kind of like a different medium for disseminating history. And then, The Wonders is a typical kind of hardback history book. But I like kind of finding these different ways of disseminating history.
Yeah, it's so funny now with, I think that's one of the things that I like most about podcasts is you can get those really interesting, like I'm a big fan of stuff you missed in history class and all these other cool podcasts that kind of touch on either people you've never even heard of or just weird, unusual topics that are far more reaching than you think. Is there like what is your current fascination? Like the new thing you found out in history, you're like, oh my god, I can't believe about.
Well, so I've just finished another Audible book, which should be coming out later this year, and I can't reveal too much, but it's set in 1938, so kind of on the eve of the Second World War, in a northern town in England, and it's a kind of true crime whodunit, where there was this mysterious assailant dubbed the Halifax Slasher, who was going around slashing predominantly working class women. And the town kind of built itself up into this massive hysteria. There were, vigilante groups and patrols, and Scotland Yard came up from London to investigate. And that's been really cool because I've got a taste for the sort of true crime history, which I really enjoyed.
That's so cool because that's kind of like one of those, when you think of historic true crime England, it's Jack the Ripper and only Jack the Ripper. So it's kind of cool to hear stuff like that. We, on our other podcast, we just did 3 unsolved mysteries of our area. And I highlighted one because, you start doing a little bit of research, and one of, at the time, and it was, I think, in like the 1960s, it was the largest amount of money stolen in the United States, and it happened right here in Plymouth. And everyone I talk to is like, I've never even heard of this. It's so bizarre that something so big happened, and you read it, and again, it's newspapers, so they're like, oh, there was panic and fear everywhere, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, I just remember there being traffic really bad one day, that kind of thing. So, it's just fascinating how much history is just like right in your backyard, and you just don't even know about it. Cool, like weird things. With my family. Sorry, go ahead.
I suppose so much of that is kind of asking those questions. There's so much history we don't know, and once you start like probing, it's amazing what you discover. And that was certainly true when I was researching freak shows. I just thought it was kind of a popular form of entertainment. But the more you dig in, the more fascinating stories you uncover. And it's, suddenly you realize, like, oh shit, that happened like round the corner from where I'm currently reading this book.
Yeah. Do you think that do you think the freak show provided a form of employment that Well, break it down pros and cons wise. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? Because I mean, some of these people would have trouble finding employment in general, and this would give them a way to, make a living. And in Tom Thumb's case, he was hugely famous. But
Yeah.
Was it a good thing or a bad thing? I suppose that's what I'm asking.
It's so hard to answer that question. And throughout my book, I kind of grapple with that, and I start with that question in the 17th century, where I look at the life of another person of short stature, a guy called Geoffrey Hudson, who was born into a poor family, 18 inches tall by the age of 7. And he ended up, believe it or not, being served in a pie to the wife of King Charles I. And he went to live with Queen
Kind of like
Henrietta
popping out of a cake, not like
popping out of a cake.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
At the midst of this great banquet to honour the king and queen, out emerged Geoffrey Hudson, son to a baker in Oakland in England, and he ended up in the inner royal sanctum. He lived with the king and queen, and he actually ended up fighting for them, believe it or not, in the English Civil War. And murdering someone, getting captured by Barbary pirates and enslaved for 25 years. Like, he had a crazy life.
Yeah.
But the question I posed in the book was, at the time, the life chances for people of short stature was exceptionally limited. They faced economic destitution, dependency on family or community, or, in this early case, someone like Geoffrey Hudson managed to win the patronage of the king and queen. And there were many people of short stature who lived with aristocrats across Europe. Now, what's better? He was well treated as well in the royal courts. He was given a salary. He was given teaching. He was taught how to hunt. He was learned basic English and French. He was given good clothes. He was mocked and bullied at the same time. But it's almost impossible to answer. What was that wholly bad? Was that better than a life of dependency or economic destitution? And that same question emerges throughout the history of the freak show. And you can point to cases like Charles Stratton being arguably a good example of someone who thrived in the freak show, although there are academics who would say, actually, no, he didn't at all. David Gerber, being a good academic who kind of questions the extent to which we should be celebrating Charles Stratton's life, because he was only 4 years old when he was on stage.
Right.
And it's a really difficult one. I came across a terrible story of a lady named Julia Pastrana, who was billed as the baboon or bear lady. She had facial hair all over her body and face, almost a double set of teeth and overgrown gums. What were her life chances in the 19th century? But in the freak show, she found employment, although she married her showman, gave birth to a baby boy in Russia, and when she died shortly after childbirth, her husband had her embalmed and displayed across Europe as the nondescript. So kind of the living Julia Pastrana became the dead Julia Pastrana, but still on display. So there's quite exploitation is everywhere in the freak show. And was it good or bad? Obviously exploitation is always bad, but what were the alternatives? Were they any better? Not really. A good example of this, and I bring it out in The Wonders, this guy called Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man, the kind of archetypal Victorian freak. And he, in his own autobiography, which is often overlooked, he said that it was his decision to enter the world of the freak show because he was so badly deformed, he couldn't find work. He ended up being incarcerated in the Leicester Union workhouse, which was really a horrible, nasty place. And he was dependent on state aid. And he decided, I could earn my own living if I entered the world of the freak show. So he managed to leave the workhouse, liberate himself from the workhouse, and enter the freak show, where he earned his own money until he was exploited, unfortunately. There were some good showmen, and he had some good showmen in London, a guy called Tom Norman, and some bad showmen. And subsequently, he was rescued, and that's in inverted commas, and taken to the London hospital, where he spent the remainder of his days. But in the London hospital, okay, he was no longer in the freak show,
Right.
but he became a medical freak,
Mm-hmm.
where he was open for experiments, photographs. When he died, his body was dissected, his skeleton bleached and displayed in the pathological museum. And one of his showmen, guy Tom Norman, actually claimed that the real exploiter was the surgeon who so-called saved Joseph Merrick, because what he did was he deprived him of independence, he deprived him of his liberty, and he incarcerated him in the London hospital as a medical freak.
What was Joseph Merrick's ailment? I know it caused him all sorts of deformities, but
he had, I always forget the medical term. He had a number of ailments. He broke his hip when he was a child, so he had a bad walk, and he had masses of flesh on his face, and kind of, I think they're benign tumors on his face and all over his body, which meant that, if for him just walking in the street, he was a spectacle.
Yeah.
He was unable to work because of his deformities.
When you were talking about how kind of like the duality of it being a positive and a negative in their life, I was thinking it sounds so much like a in medieval times you'd have the court jester, and frequently they were deformed or mentally disabled, and it's like, you're the butt end of the joke for the entire kingdom, but you're probably living a better life than the majority of people. It's such a weird,
It's so, and in a slightly different manner, we have these debates about reality TV shows today.
Mm-hmm.
Are they exploitative, or do they give a platform for ordinary people?
I would go with question or answer one. I would definitely lean towards that.
But you hear Jerry Springer, he comes up with all these reasons as to why, actually, I'm offering a platform for these people. Why shouldn't they be filmed and have their moment in the camera?
Yeah.
Different kind of debate, but those questions of exploitation or empowerment, coercion, choice in the field of entertainment, they still exist.
And I always find that reality television really brings into debate the definition of fame. I can't remember what I was watching. It was some celebrity version of a reality show, like Celebrity Survivor. I can't remember which one it was. And I'm watching, I'm like, I don't know who any of these people are. I'm like, how are these celebrities? And who I was watching with was like, well, that person's from Big Brother and that person's from... And I'm like, so they're famous for not being famous on other shows?
Ricky Gervais is... Sorry, go on, man.
Oh, and it's just kind of like, what is our definition of celebrity anymore?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think Ricky Gervais is quite interesting on it, because I'm massively paraphrasing, but he talks about, today, like, often there's this drive for fame's sake.
Yeah.
We kind of seek fame rather than, like, being good at your craft and fame being an afterthought. There's this desire for fame's sake. The birth of celebrity, it's a really interesting one, and it's become so incredibly vapid.
Yeah. And it's like the social media has created these media, influencers, which I don't, if you have that platform and you're using that platform just to kind of get yourself out there and people like what you have to say, that's fine. But they had an instance just the other day where one of these influencers posted on her Instagram account that she was helping board up windows prior to a protest, hopefully avoiding a riot. And someone shortly after posted a video of her pulling over just as some guy's boarding up his business. She's like, hey, can I give you a hand? He's like, yeah, sure. So she gets out of the car and like takes the drill and poses for the picture and then hands the drill back. She's like, thanks, and leaves. And I'm like, it's just so like, what's the point? Like, what do you? Yeah, it's exploiting yourself in a weird way.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because one of the things that's always influenced or interested me is this relationship between like public personas and private realities, and the relationship between the two. And like things like Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, they really encourage us to project a public image of ourselves that we want people to see. And in many ways, a freak show was very similar. The people on stage were embodying an image of as the Elephant Man or as Tom Thumb, which is quite different to Charles Stratton or Joseph Merrick. And that kind of dynamic between our public persona and our private insecurities is a really interesting one. And some of the, without wanting to be all fuddy-duddy about it, but some of the these social media platforms, I think they can be quite harmful. And, impressionable people looking through them and think like these are an honest reflection on someone's life, whereas actually they're completely socially constructed to suggest a certain... And it's weird, isn't it? Like that idea of you can't do good now unless other people know about it.
Right.
And I find that weird. Like even ones like personal success, it almost doesn't mean anything until other people know about it. What's that about?
Yeah.
I find,
it's kind of that, you need to be happy with yourself, but people tend to think they'll be happy with themselves if other people are happy with or for them, I suppose.
Yeah.
But I always find, to me, the weirdest thing about social media and people complaining about it is the majority of the algorithms show you what you interact with. So when people start to be like, oh, it's so negative, I'm like, that's, it's kind of a mirror.
Yeah.
Stop interacting with negative things. I kind of go out of my way to avoid that stuff. So I get a lot of local event type stuff on my Facebook and a lot of dogs. And, I kind of make sure that when I see positive things, I interact with that because that's what I want to see,
Absolutely. I'm the same. But it's interesting as well because for years I was always quite, anti all of that social media stuff. And particularly when The Wonders came out, I realized just how important it was in this day and age to have an online presence and to engage with things like Twitter. So I do that now because, I got, one's got to sell books.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Well, you need it.
It's so funny. It comes up frequently on the podcast about social media, and I don't think once someone has been like, "Oh, I really enjoy it. It's a lot of fun." It's always like, "Yeah, it's just part of the business, and I have to do it." And so, it's interesting. I think generally creative people don't love social media. I mean, it's not. I think out of all of them, YouTube, I can say, is probably the creative one. Instagram, maybe, but I don't know. It's kind of the generic photography platform. It's set up so to do everything for you. But generally, it's not a creative platform to be on, any of them. So it's not surprising that people are like, ugh.
Yeah, screw that.
Yeah.
It's also, I wonder if it's a stubbornness thing with creative. I don't know if this is true across the board, but I know certainly for me, if I'm not interested in something, I'm like, I just don't really engage.
Yeah.
And actually, sometimes I have to engage with things I'm not interested in. And social media is one of them.
I can see that. That's why I'm a terrible student. Like, I would do great in like a class for like 3 months because it was an interesting topic, or like I'd do great in one class and none of the other ones. Because it didn't hold my attention. It was just
switch up.
Yeah, it was very, very difficult. Did you have that struggle when you were going through school, or were you just kind of engaged in all of it?
No, it's funny, because I, growing up, I was, I played the dumb kid at school in a way, and I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic, so I was always shit at reading. And I was never dumb, but I kind of played the idiot, and I struggled with reading and writing. And I did quite bad at my GCSEs, the exams you take aged 15, 16. And it was really only when I went to high school. Is that the best? Is that the right? We call it sixth form here. So when you're like 17 and 18,
yeah,
you do A levels. Right?
Yeah.
And it was only at that time, and I met a teacher who kind of really inspired me and really encouraged me in history, and I started getting really involved in history. And he encouraged me to apply to the University of Cambridge, which I'd never thought about at all. And I went through that process, and then I started getting much more serious about kind of history and academia. Then I got in. Then I dropped out for 10 days. Yeah. Then I went back again. So always plagued by self-doubt. But so that's a long way of saying, like, no, I was a bad student for a lot of my years, and I'm crap at most subjects. But I found my niche, and I'm all right at history.
So now I'm really intrigued. So you say you're dyslexic, and you just, you have a book and Audible books. I am, I'd say, about 90% convinced that I have an undiagnosed learning disorder, because I grew up in like the late 70s and early 80s, and you're just dumb at that point, where they're like, you're just shit at spelling. What's wrong with you? That kind of thing. And I don't read. Like, I absorb information through. It was weird. Like, I never thought about it as a kid, but if I paid attention in class and took the notes, I'd never be able to read the notes because my handwriting is horrible. But just that process of listening and writing it down generally meant I would do fine on whatever test it was. But how did you go from, like you said, you're shit at reading, but like you wrote a book, and that seems like counterintuitive.
Yeah, in a way I was lucky, because I grew up in the 1990s when, and my mum was quite hot on it, because she was always like, she knew I wasn't dumb, and she got me. I can't remember. I went to a child psychologist or something or other. Anyway, I got a diagnosis for dyslexia, dyspraxia, and that was incredibly helpful, because then it helped me learn some techniques that were useful for reading and writing. And so many of those techniques, I couldn't even tell you what I do now, but I kind of internalized them. And that massively helped with reading and writing. And I mean, I was always plagued with kind of a bit of self-doubt around it, which was a big reason as to why I dropped out. And my spelling is terrible. My handwriting is atrocious. I've got the worst memory ever. I've got a terrible working memory. It's embarrassing. But I built up confidence, and I learned different strategies for reading. And, I managed to kind of overcome it. And, go to Cambridge, do a PhD, do a book, and it hasn't held me back.
That's awesome.
So I'm very lucky.
Nice. You mentioned earlier that you co-wrote a book, Stephen Fry's Victorian Secrets. Am I remembering the title correctly?
Yeah, that's the one.
I am a huge Stephen Fry fan.
Oh, cool.
Did you get to work with him at all, or meet him, or?
Yeah. So we met a fair few times in recording studios and discussing various ideas, and great man to work with, real intellectual giant, and it was a real privilege. It was funny because I'd put in for a job for a radio presenting job, which I never got. But the producer emailed me and said, like, oh, we kind of like your CV, like, let's meet up, have a chat. And so we went for a coffee, we got chatting, we kind of came up with this idea of secrets and Victorian secrets as a way of kind of telling interesting stories about the Victorian age and approaching it from a different angle. And this producer, a guy called Nick Baker, he had worked with Stephen Fry on a bunch of radio things before. He said, like, I bet Stephen would really like this. And so we took it to Stephen, and he did really like it. So it became Stephen Fry's Victorian Secrets. And, kind of the rest was history. But it was great because, to work with him, and he endorsed me, and his quote is on the, front page of my book.
Oh, nice.
So that was really cool. I was very lucky.
Yeah, a good friend of mine turned me on to QI a number of years ago, and in a really, really roundabout sort of way, that's how we got into podcasting.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so he's like, oh, you got to check out the show, blah, blah. It's called QI. And right away, like, just because I love comedy, I love history, I love trivia, and it's like, it's that perfect soup of that show where it's weird, bizarre facts and factoids that you can bore people with.
Yeah.
And comedians being immature. It's such a fun show. And so we kind of became obsessed with it and watched as much as we could because it's not aired over here, so we would have to find it online or on YouTube or something like that.
Yeah.
And then I don't remember when it started, but the same friend of mine, the guy that runs Inebri-art with me, he's like, the researchers for QI just put out a podcast called No Such Thing as Fish. And I'm like, oh, cool. So I started listening to that, and that's the first podcast that I started listening to that got me into podcasts in general. And so it kind of became this, high water mark. And we're like, hey, if, they started to go on tour, I'm like, if they ever come to the United States, if they're anywhere near us at all, we're going to see them. And when No Such Thing as Fish went on their first U.S. tour just recently, I think it was just in the fall, the first place they stopped was Boston. So we're like, we're in, we're going.
Oh, nice.
So, yeah, so I've always, ever since then, big fan of Stephen Fry's, and
he's great.
Yeah, he seems like such a nice guy.
Yeah, so, really nice guy. Really
little jealous of you, gotta say. So are there, so I'm thinking one specifically, but are there not necessarily freak show, but so let me, do you know what the Muter Museum is?
In Philadelphia?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I got to go there, and I was just thinking of that because of Chang and Ang's Deathcast was there.
Mm.
So does your freak show interest carry over to kind of those medical oddities in general? And are you considering ever doing, like, because you said Joseph Merrick became like a medical freak, and is there a follow-up to Wonders more in the medical field?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Certainly in the Wonders, the presence of medicine is always there. Mm-hmm. And so many of these freak performers ended up as pathological specimens or were hounded by the medical profession, who were desperate to get their hands on the corpses of the bodies of freak performers. And in the beginning of the 19th century, in the case of Chang and Eng, it's quite interesting because they were actively encouraged to attend the shows, and they even got private performances, because if you had medical men endorsing a show, it sort of testified to the authenticity of the show, and also gave it a greater social standing. So Chang and Eng, always had medical men buzzing around them. In London, the sort of equivalent to the Museum of Philadelphia, we have the Hunterian Museum, which has a number of specimens of individuals who were in the freak show of the 18th century, the so-called Irish Giant and Sicilian Fairy, whose bodies were actually essentially stolen once they died. So it's in the Wonders. And so I probably won't do a follow-up in that area, but I've certainly looked at it, and it certainly features in the Wonders.
So you said that they would use medical professionals to show the authenticity of it. Were there a lot of fakes?
Yeah, there was. Yeah, I mean, sort of deception was the name of the game in the freak show. So you might have a giant surreptitiously standing on stilts, or so-called Siamese twins who were, secretly bound together by a rope. Often the kind of so-called savages or cannibals were often, just natives who had sort of dressed up and started yelling in, odd languages. So a lot of very performative, lots of deception. So when someone like Chang and Eng first hit the freak show scene in Britain, which was in 1829, they were really keen, the showmen were really keen to stress that these were actually conjoined twins, which they were. And so in 1829 in the Egyptian Hall, Piccadilly, London, they had this special performance for the medical profession, who came round and wrote a sort of letter testifying to their authenticity. So yeah, lots of deception in the freak show, and medical men were quite a good way of validating freak performance.
It just made me think of, and I'm not going to know her name or the exact time, but I would say it's around that era. There was a woman who became famous for giving birth to rabbits.
Oh yeah, Mary Tuft, I think.
Yeah, and it became like such a big thing, and of course it was a big scam. But the whole process of finding doctors, and I think she was bribing doctors to say it was real, and it's just, it's that Instagram, I'll do anything to be famous kind of.
Yeah, the woman who gave birth to, she was the 18th century, I think. And it went all the way up to royalty. There was a whole big hoo-ha.
Yeah, it was like a big thing for quite a while. Yeah. But the other scam that jumped to mind, and I don't know, maybe you can tell me if this is true, because I know I've seen it in film, so it's got to be true. But the sideshow would put up a poster with a big chicken on it, and it would say "man eating chicken," and then you would go inside the tent, and there'd just be some guy at a table eating chicken.
Yeah,
it screams P.T. Barnum. But
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's a good example of that in the English travelling fairs in the early 19th century. But two, actually. One is a showman advertising the fall of China, the fall of the Chinese Empire, fall of China, and people would go in expecting to see, a sort of model of China and what have you, and what they'd see is, some porcelain on the floor that smashed. China's fall. Or one of my favourites was a big poster outside a tent that said, "The man with two, no ladies admitted." And so, lots of men were excited, and they'd go into the tent, and it'd be a man with two thumbs. I thought it was quite good.
Yeah, it's so weird, because it was almost like the entertainment was the fact that you had been duped. I don't think that sort of thing could happen today.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
The showman Tom Norman, who had exhibited Joseph Merrick in London, he said that you could exhibit anything in those days. It was all about the tale you told. And if you could weave a good yarn, you could exhibit anything. And I think, there was the entertainment factor, there was the joy of being duped, or the things like the Fiji mermaid. That question, Barnum was so good at this, was, is it real or isn't it? I must pay to go and find out for myself.
Were there animal wonders? Because I remember, God, this is going way back, probably the 1980s, the Barnum and Bailey Circus, when they still had, traveling with animals and whatnot, they were billing that they had a unicorn, and it was like, and it was just a goat with like a singular horn.
Yeah, there's loads of freaky animals, giant oxes, pigs with 5 feet, all of that. Yeah. That was a staple of the sideshows and the traveling fairs and the freak shows.
If you could, would you go back and visit freak shows?
Yeah, definitely. I spent so long studying them, I wouldn't miss the opportunity. And then, yeah, absolutely. One of the things I try and do in the Wonders is kind of evoke what it was like to go into a freak show, and what people thought when they were in the freak shows as well. And different people had different responses to them.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, going and seeing one in the 19th century, having studied it for so long, would be incredible. But as you said, today you go on. I mean, you've got kind of there are some sideshows that still go on, and there is Coney Island, Fraser.
They're more skill based, though.
Yeah, exactly.
The people that can. God, my brain's just not working today. Contortionists and the blockheads who can hammer a nail into his face. We actually have a local guy here. There's a Renaissance fair called King Richard's Fair, and some local kid just got into that fire eating and putting his arm in a bear trap, and so he started performing. I'm not sure if he started performing at King Richard's Fair, but he does perform there every year. I believe his name's Matt Carney, and just a great entertainer, like just real funny, and fire eater, breathes fire, puts fish hooks in his eyes. The gross kind of body manipulation that you would see at a sideshow nowadays.
Yeah.
And he always has a huge crowd whenever he performs there because there's fire and it's gross. I mean, what else do you want?
Yeah, exactly. Ticks all the boxes.
Yeah. Do you guys in London have a modern version going on over there?
Well, one of the arguments I make in the Wonders is that the freak show as an institution has kind of died, but it's metamorphosized into different forms of popular entertainment. So, all the ingredients of titillation, voyeurism, and spectatorship. And you'd see that, we talked about reality TV shows.
Yeah. That's
the sort of offspring of freak shows. But we also have Ripley's Believe It or Not in Leicester Square, and Gutter von Hagen, I'm sure I pronounced his name wrong, Body Worlds.
Oh, yeah. That's so cool.
Yeah, amazing stuff. So we've kind of got like different forms of freak shows still with us, but nothing like the freak show that in its heyday.
Well, I think as a society we've pushed the threshold where if you build someone as the tattooed lady now, they'd be like, so what?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. She lives around the corner.
Yeah. Which one? That doesn't help me.
Yeah. Exactly. We've all got tats now.
Yeah. Or like with the internet, some far off tribal culture, you'd be like, yeah, I can just Google that.
Yeah. And that's it. At the time when this stuff was so popular, the world it wasn't like it is now. It wasn't as easily accessible. So like, seeing Zulu savages was like genuinely really awe-inspiring and informative. People learned a lot about foreign. Now, most of it was bullshit, but they felt they were learning something, some form of ethnography through these shows. So they could suspend disbelief much more than we can today.
It's really interesting. This has been a super ton of fun because, like I said,
I enjoyed
about the weird macabre has always been fun for me. Where can people go to get Wonders?
On Amazon, it's available all good online outlets and some good bookshops. But Amazon's probably the best bet. The Wonders, the extraordinary performers who transformed the Victorian Age. Or if you just whack John Woolf Freak Show into Google, my website should come up, and
That's a great way to tell people to like search for you. Oh, just
Yeah.
Google my name and Freak Show, it'll come up.
But yeah, all the support would be great. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and they can check out your book on Audible, the Stephen Fry Victorian Secrets, and you have another one coming up. Are you able to tell the title and the release date yet? Or
I'm not actually, okay. And I don't know the release date. The Wonders is also an Audible as well.
Okay,
interesting. But yeah, watch this space because there'll be something else coming out soon.
Yeah, so people can just keep track. I mean, they got nothing else to do. It's quarantine.
Yeah, that's it. Follow me on Twitter.
Follow John Woolf, and
That's it. At Dr. John Woolf.
Yeah, this is an absolute pleasure, man. I want to thank you for talking.
Cheers,
to us.
Andy.
And I want to thank you listeners for listening to us ramble on about weird stuff. And we'll see you guys on the next show.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. You can find us on all social medias at Inebri-art, except for Instagram, we're at Inebri-art6. You can email us with your questions, complaints, and whatnot at Inebri-art@yahoo.com. And if you're looking for more podcasts, you can check out the other podcasts on our network, Retro Redoctopus, America's Hometown Horror, and, of course, Bar Talk, Old Colony, and Inebri-art Podcast, the original. So check those out and subscribe and comment so we can reach more people, and thanks for listening.